Hello, friends. I would like to speak today on what for me was the most important and most impactful chapter of the Autobiography of a Yogi, the chapter called An Experience in Cosmic Consciousness. Let me explain why it was so impactful for me. I had been looking for something to explain the scope of man's consciousness. I'd been looking all my life for that. In college, I studied psychology, hoping I would find it there, but I certainly didn't. And I didn't know where I could find something that really spoke to me until I found that great book, Autobiography of a Yogi, which changed my life as it has changed the lives of so many, many people. Devi and I have met probably thousands of people who had their lives, the course of their lives, diverted in a positive direction by that book. But coming back to the chapter on An Experience in Cosmic Consciousness, there are so many lessons in that if you read it carefully. The first is that it occurs after the story of Master's life, and you can see his long preparation. From a child, he was seeking God, and from a child, he had certain experiences of expanded consciousness, but it never satisfied his heart. And consequently, he kept looking and looking. He went to an ashram. That didn't satisfy him. And then he met his guru, Sri Yukteswar. And that was the turning point in his search, as probably finding the autobiography or finding a true teacher has been the turning point for so many others of us who are on the path. So coming back to that chapter, it takes place after this long preparation, but the chapter begins in a very interesting way. Yogananda had often thought from a vision when he was young that he would find enlightenment in the Himalayas by joining the yogis of the Himalayas, those yogis living away from society, perhaps in caves, completely focused, completely dedicated on living a life of search for God alone. But often he had tried to go to the Himalayas, but his journeys there were always thwarted. Finally, at the beginning of this chapter, he has indeed left the ashram of Sri Yukteswar, gone to the Himalayas, and he had other adventures also, not mentioned in the Autobiography of a Yogi. But then, rather shamefacedly, he returns to Sri Yukteswar. And so the chapter begins with his return to his guru. And the surprising thing to Yogananda is that there was no censure whatsoever in Sri Yukteswar. No, oh, you ran away, I depended on you. Yogananda apologized to his guru, saying, I must have left many tasks unfinished for you. And Sri Yukteswar explains that he had no expectation of Yogananda. He didn't expect anything of anyone. He was simply there to help them in their own search. The important point here is that Yogananda said that unconditional acceptance expanded his heart because he found unconditional love in Sri Yukteswar, and that expanded his heart. Now, he was destined only a few days later to have this great experience. But it's important to note that that experience doesn't come just kind of like spontaneous combustion. Long preparation and then something that expands our heart sufficiently to hold the, one might say, the blazing sun of realization that comes with samadhi, or the experience of cosmic consciousness. Then another very interesting aspect of this chapter is that we normally think that such an experience comes through some long, intense, deep meditation where you go deeper and deeper with greater and greater focus, greater effort, and finally through that you arrive at the door to infinity. Quite the opposite for Yogananda's experience. He said he sat to meditate and his mind was all over the place. He said, like dry wind blowing leaves in the air. And Sri Yukteswar calls to him and says, Mukunda? And Yogananda, whose name at the time was Mukunda, says, I'm meditating. And Sri Yukteswar doesn't let him by with that. He says, Mukunda, I know how you're meditating. Come here. And so it's a humorous but important point that when we're ready, that experience is going to come to us. We don't need necessarily to go to it. And so Yogananda rather shamefacedly arrives, and his guru says, poor boy, the mountains will not give you what you seek. And Yogananda said he rarely, Sri Yukteswar rarely indulged in puzzles of this nature. And he wondered what his master was saying. And then he tapped him on the chest. And Yogananda said it was as if an enormous magnet drew the breath out of me. My body became rigid and still, and my consciousness expanded, so he was no longer seeing as we do through our two eyes. The world in front of us, his consciousness, his vision was 360 degrees, and he saw through walls, he saw into the roots of plants. But this is, again, very important in that chapter. He didn't see those things. He became them. He said, I felt them on my own periphery. So it wasn't like he was still centered in the limited ego. His consciousness expanded so that he felt the thoughts of men. He could see a cow wandering, even though it was behind a brick wall, then it came to a gate. He could see it clearly, see it continuing as it went behind a wall. But again, it wasn't just seeing. It was all of that was happening in his own self, in his own periphery of consciousness. And then he went on to say that in that great experience, he said, I realized that the center of the vast imperium, the center of all of creation, is an intuitive perception in my own heart. So everything in the universe came from his own heart. Well, does that mean that only Yogananda is lucky enough to be the center of the universe? No. He's saying that the universe is an expansion from our intuitive perception. And when we have that great experience of cosmic consciousness, and that intuition is opened, that then we can experience the whole of creation as being our own self, and it starts with wherever we're located, in the center of our own intuitive perception in our heart. And so that experience lasted for some time, and then it stopped. Sri Yukteswar stopped it. And Yogananda said it felt crushing, a huge disappointment. And Sri Yukteswar said, "You must not get overdrunk with ecstasy. Come, let us sweep the porch. You have much yet to do in this life." And so it is for us. Perhaps we won't have the experience of cosmic consciousness, but in meditation, our consciousness will expand. But then we have to take that expanded consciousness, return to our duties, and as much as possible with that enlightened consciousness or uplifted consciousness, then go about our duties with that expanded heart and expanded consciousness. And in that way, the circuit of meditation and service that Yogananda described as the true path comes together. And so in this chapter, all of that is expressed. And then finally, Yogananda says that as often as I was able to still the breath and the restless mind, said that those two forces are like storms on the sea of our consciousness. And as long as he was able to still those storms, he could return to that state and return to it at will. And so this chapter is so filled with, with a thrilling rendition of what is lying ahead for all of us. I think for me, what made perhaps the most impactful aspect of this was I could feel its authenticity, its veracity. You know, in modern movies and in literature, you hear secondhand descriptions of expansion of consciousness or going into the cosmos or going into warp speed, whatever it is. But you always know in the back of your mind that this is just someone's fantasy or someone's directorial vision of what it might be like. But it isn't firsthand experience. All the way through the autobiography, what makes it so impactful and gives it the power to become life-changing is that Yogananda, his authenticity and his actual experience of these things makes them real and expands the scope of reality in such a thrilling manner. And as I say, for me personally, I had been searching for that my entire life, and finding the autobiography of a yogi, and especially this chapter, somehow eased something in my life. Not that it brought me to that point of consciousness, not yet, but it gave me a clear, absolutely bedrock faith that such a state does exist, such a state is attainable, and such a state eventually will come under the control of our own ability to go there whenever we want or whenever it is right for us. And so, while, as Sri Yukteswar said, we must not become overdrunk with ecstasy, the mere fact that we know without a shadow of a doubt that the state of ecstasy does exist, the expansion of consciousness, the becoming of everything in creation does exist, and that it is our destiny, gives us, if we choose it, a life direction and a support for any effort that we might make. God bless you all.